So we wanted to just set the scene with the 6Ds of disruption. And the 6Ds of disruption illustrates the notion that disruption is exponential. And we think as people, as humans, we think in a linear fashion. You know, we're used to seeing things in a linear fashion, and we don't really understand exponentiality, and we don't see it coming. It's highly deceptive. So once something starts to be digitized, you don't realize that it's happening. If you take, for example, Kodak, as very briefly, Kodak is the famous story of a business that went bang in 2012 after they in fact invented the digital camera some 15 years earlier, but the board said we're not going to launch a digital camera. Our business is more about printing high glossy pictures and film. So Kodak didn't see that coming, and that's because it's so deceptive. And of course, once it goes into the exponential phase, then it becomes disruptive. And if you think about, if you took 30 steps, you can easily imagine 30 steps from here to on a field. If you go for a walk, you can imagine where you'll be in 30 steps. But 30 exponential steps would actually take you, and an exponential step is a doubling. Every time, if it doubles every time, 30 exponential steps would take you 26 times around the earth. And this is why our brains just can't fathom this. So 10 exponentials gives you 1,000, but 20 gives you 1,000,000, and 30 actually gives you 1,000,000,000. So when things start to go exponential, our brains can't fathom it. We can't keep up, and we can't see it coming. And then what happens is the disruption occurs, and it begins to dematerialize. So I'll talk about dematerialization in a bit more detail shortly. Alistair will talk about demonetisation shortly in a few minutes. And then, of course, these things become democratized. So we've got all of those aspects being covered in upcoming slides. So firstly, digitized. I mentioned Kodak. Think about your cell phone. 20 years later, all of these things, radio, camera, calculator, are in your cell phone. So they're completely digitized. And when your industry or business gets changed and turned on its head because you didn't see or act in time, like Kodak, that digital disrupts you. So, and it's highly deceptive. I mean, we didn't see COVID-19 coming. COVID-19 caught many businesses, industries, and individuals completely off guard. And guess last year, many people were expecting a return to normality. But I love this slide because this really shows you how disruptive these things can and will be. So COVID-19 is an accelerant to the disruption of healthcare, travel, transport, education, property, agriculture, finance, and even space, as you're going to hear a little bit later. So what this slide illustrates is that all of these technologies, artificial intelligence, this comes from ARK Invest. If you're not following ARK Invest, I highly recommend you do. Artificial intelligence, energy storage. I mean, I saw an article this morning that energy storage has declined in price by 90% over the last 10 years. Imagine that. It's mind-blowing. Robotics, genome sequencing, and blockchain technology. So this is just 5 exponential technologies that were deceptive in the 2000s, but they're now going exponential. And the big issue is that they're all going exponential at the same time, and they're affecting multiple industries at the same time. So this is mind-blowing, and this is going to hit us harder than you can imagine. So you remember this picture? So never mind all of this stuff. We no longer need separate systems of record, data sources. It's all in a digital ledger on the blockchain. Alistair, over to you. Are you going
Thanks very much, Craig. So some of the good examples that we see around, what is being dematerialized, not just in the technology and science domain, is what we use and functions across the economy. I think one of the most interesting things that I'm seeing worldwide is that banks are starting to launch virtual currencies and digital cards, but there will be no need for plastic cards, credit cards, debit cards, or even virtual cards, to be honest with you. So, what is important about blockchain is that it's like Lego blocks that when you put them together, you can't pull them apart, and that creates an immutable record. So, when you transact with money, it's real time. And the kind of transactions that you see on open source free technologies will be, for example, 10,000 transactions per second with a marginal cost. Now, you can imagine how much of a threat that is to banking and cross-border payments, for example. Central banks, they exist to regulate flow of money and bring order in terms of the flow of cash, money supply, recording it. And when a technology like blockchain dematerializes the expense, the infrastructure, and the complexity, there is no need for central banks. We normally apologize a lot to lawyers, bankers, and accountants when we talk about blockchain, but the rapid move here is that when you have a distributed technology where it's based on consensus and there's no one central point, there's no need for regulatory requirements. It's based on trust and consensus across a whole lot of people. So another thing around lawyers, for example, the whole legal and even accounting fraternity is just based on rules. I know that I'm oversimplifying it, and sorry to the lawyers and accountants there. But if you want to buy a house or a car or transfer a property or get an opinion, you can reduce that set of rules into a dematerialized technology such as blockchain. I've spoken about currency exchanges, but there's no more waiting of 2 or 3 days, and you don't need clearinghouses. This happens within seconds in terms of cross-border payments, and it's based on a mutual or trusted contract that lives inside the technology. So, a couple of years ago, this was only available to governments, large corporates, and academia, and you can use some of these technologies that we'll show a little bit later for a dematerialized cost, if I can put that out there. So on the next slide. One important thing to understand is that the phenomena of blockchain, I think, has got more power than the cryptocurrency of Bitcoin. There are two different things for people that have not been exposed to this. The one is like a digital currency, and the other one is the Lego blocks. Those Lego blocks demonetize and make it cheap and accessible to track supply chain. So everything from the fields in Kenya to the table in Washington, you can track every step of the way. You can connect and record data on blockchain. And one of my favorites is still on that slide, Craig.
Right.
Finance and accounting has spent the last, and now pause here, 1,000 years doing double-sided entries. That will fall away. It already is. So all the needs for like general ledgers, recording, a consolidation, regulatory reporting gets replaced by immutable records in something that is demonetized. This is important if you're an entrepreneur, because you can build the backbone of your business on this stuff.
Alistair, there's an interesting question from Jody Hill in Australia. Thanks for joining us so early or so late. Lawyers are discussing this in Australia, but nobody seems to be moving quickly. What would you recommend, Alistair? I know we're doing some live demo stuff a bit later. I don't know if you want to touch quickly. Yeah.
Jody, I'm going to be showing, so this is all PowerPoint, which I'm not a fan of. I'm doing some live demos after our first speaker. There's a question that I ask everybody that says, what now and where do I start? I'm going to visit a website and show you where lawyers anywhere in the world can connect with other people and start experimenting in a sandbox for free. And you can find other lawyers that are trying to solve the same thing right now. So I'll keep it for then. Please remind me when I show the demo where to go. There's a specific place where you can go and click and meet other like-minded innovators in the legal domain. So I'll happily speak with you around that, because we're doing something in South Africa around democratizing kind of your preparatory notes for advocates. So there's lots happening in that space. And I'll keep it for when I visit that site after the first speaker. Very good. I'm going to finish with citizen records. So birth and death records, transferring of properties, any public record transaction. This is also going to sound wild. There's no need for government administration anywhere worldwide. If you've got a democratized and demonetized technology where you can have consensus of hundreds of millions of citizens working on the backbone of blockchain. So I know it sounds pretty wild, but when you work with this, you'll see, like, why would I ever fill out a form again in the rest of my life when I buy a property, or a birth certificate that tracks me from birth to death? It's very important, fundamental things. And just to note over here, Why is blockchain only being adopted now? It's because of Bitcoin, which I'm not focusing on, but a method of high-speed payment at low cost is driving large-scale adoption. And people are starting to realize that the one is a digital currency, but the power of what you can do with the blockchain underneath that in terms of building backbones for business, ecosystems worldwide, transactional systems, and things like that, instead of having long software development cycles and projects and complicated things like that, is starting to drive that adoption. So I think that's just the headlines in terms of, what's out there and which parts to pay attention to, and a few use cases, which I will then link to in terms of some kind of live demos on the web and things that you can go and visit and play around, where you can start experimenting with your own value propositions after today. Thank you, Craig.
And so then what happens is this stuff becomes democratized. So if you haven't heard of, I'm sure you've heard of Moore's Law, and Moore's Law is about that doubling that we spoke about earlier, but you might not have heard of Wright's Law. So what Wright's Law says is that the marginal cost of supply reduces exponentially. So what's happening actually is these things are getting cheaper and cheaper. I used the example of solar has become 90% cheaper in the last 10 years. That is mind-blowing, and that is happening with multiple technologies. So watch Wright's Law, and then Kurzweil's law talks about accelerating returns. So of course, as the marginal cost of supply reduces, your returns increase, and this is what is fueling exponentialities, exponential business models, etc. So we are running a bit ahead of time.
So while Levo is getting busy, I think, so all of the people on the call that are entrepreneurs, I remember what I felt like when I watched presentations like this, like a couple of years ago. I thought, that's nice. It sounds like theory. What can I do on Monday? And it's at this point that I want to point out to you guys, there is a difference between incrementally changing and adding something to your business and creating something brand new and experimenting in the market. For example, there is no need to wait to incrementally improve on property sales or public records or birth and death records. If you as an entrepreneur go into a sandbox and you create something where you can record property transfers as an MVP, and you visit some real estate agents with your proposition, you climb in your car, you have a Zoom, you visit them and say, are you willing to do your 3 transactions on here with safe, trusted entities and see how this works? That is the starting point of an entrepreneur that will disrupt an entire industry. And I think it's super important to know, the websites we show you later, don't leave it. This will take you a couple of days. Minimum viable product. Sorry, yeah, the acronyms we're perhaps a little bit too used to it. I sincerely encourage you to take some of the use cases that we're showing you today and try and build them. You don't have to be a coder. You just need to be an entrepreneur that's good at spotting market problems and fixing customer pains, and then applying technologies to that. So, it's so important to understand there's nothing stopping you from accessing these demonetized and democratized technologies and putting it out there. You will lose very little other than attracting attention of people that are interested in doing something at a low cost at high speed. So
awesome, Alistair. Thanks so much for that. Yeah, that's great. I mean, we really are trying to keep it practical and real. And Lebo is ready, so I'm gonna bring him on in a second. But just to add to what Alistair was saying, we are here to support you, to guide you to create minimum viable products and validate these market concepts. So that's part of what we're doing in the democratized entrepreneurship community.